The first one, the VanPatten et al. 2013 was listening. All the treatment assessment was listening. The VanPatten and Smith study that was just submitted is both listening and reading. So they had both oral and written input, and the measurement we used afterwards was reading sentences. Aptitude correlates largely with explicit learning, but not acquisition as we defined it here. It correlates with people's ability to consciously learn externally defined rules. It does not correlate with or emerge as a significant factor, or really any kind of factor, in acquisition if we define acquisition as the evolution of a mental representation over time. Does this mean that there are no individual differences in language acquisition? Does it mean that some people are not better than others? Clearly not. We have evidence that they are. We have evidence that some people do some things faster than others. And if you want to call faster than others being better than others, you can do that. That's fine. People differ as to rate of acquisition and how quickly they progress through stages. For example, the stages of negation. Even though everybody goes through those stages of negation, some go through faster, those stages, than others. People differ as to how far they get. There's a lot of variation. There's a lot of variation in acquisition. We saw variation in our performance and our measures. So even though we didn't see aptitude as correlating with anything or being a factor with anything, we did see some people got to process language sooner than other people. Or some people did it later than other people. To what are owed such differences in rate of acquisition and ultimate attainment? Well, it could be motivation, interest, if you're motivated, but that doesn't really, as a linguist, it doesn't tell me much because motivation permeates everything. Like The Biggest Loser, who loses weight on the people who are more motivated and stick with it? Is it something like working memory, this little space you have in real time that allows you to juggle multiple things at once in a millisecond by millisecond basis? Is it that? We don't know. Could it be something else? Here's the point, is that in the end, what we have is a fact about acquisition, that learners vary from one to another in terms of rate and ultimate attainment. That is how far they get. What's not clear is the explanation for that fact. In short, I don't think we have an explanation for it at all. It's one of the great mysteries. But what's emerging now is that aptitude, when we say, oh, that person has a higher aptitude for language, that's not the factor we should be talking about. We clearly don't want to identify people as good learners and bad learners or mediocre learners based on some aptitude test, because those aptitude tests do not speak to the kinds of things we're talking about today, which is the nature of acquisition. In the end, acquisition is just too complex of an endeavor to reduce it to some simple ideas. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I'm going to speak directly to people involved in language education. When it comes to parameter resetting, and we also looked at learning case marking in Japanese, aptitude makes no difference at all, absolutely none. So these studies suggest that maybe we're too quick about aptitude. And why would these studies suggest that? Because these two studies are fundamentally different from previous research. First of all, aptitude is very clearly correlates with outcomes measured when the learning is explicit. Okay, so you teach rules and you test rules. But remember, my paradigm says there are no rules to be learned. So in the first experiment with Russian, French, Spanish, we weren't testing their knowledge of object pronouns or causative fair. We were finding out if they could process sentences correctly. That's what we were after. Not if they knew a rule, because first of all, we didn't believe there was a rule to learn anyway. If you believe that there's some kind of rule you have in your head and you teach a rule and then practice that rule, aptitude is actually predicated on that paradigm. It's an outdated paradigm. If you've heard somebody say this, theory and research is all that is nice, but I don't have the luxury of time. So I need to teach students grammar and vocabulary so they get it. Okay. Underlying this is get it for what? To take a test. So it reveals a couple of things, that the person believes there are shortcuts maybe, or does not realize that the person is really teaching to a test. Okay. The person may also think that there actually are rules to be learned, and thus those rules are found in textbooks. And if there are rules to be learned and found in textbooks, those rules can be tested. And what I'm trying to get you to understand is that's just not the case. So there are no shortcuts. Acquisition is too complex to reduce it to something simple as a shortcut. And there are no rules to be learned as such. There just are not. So let's look at what makes acquisition complex very briefly. First of all, at any given point in time, what is going on in the learner's mind-brain? Irrespective of what you're doing in the class, irrespective of what the learner's doing at homework, irrespective of anything else going on in the environment in terms of input. Simultaneously, the learner is working on lexicon, and morphology. At the same time, the person is working on phonology. At the same time, the person is working on syntactic features and constraints on sentence formation. At the same time, the person is working on pragmatics and discourse. At the same time, the person is working on interfaces between all these things. At the same time, the person is working on communicative competence. At the same time, the person is working on skill, how these things get realized in real time. And the list goes on. We could keep making our list. These happen all at once. I can't stop and now let's work on syntax. And now you got syntax good. Now work on vocabulary. Okay, now work on pronunciation. Acquisition doesn't happen that way. Through process and through input and through the processing of input and the language mechanism in your head, you're doing it all at once. That doesn't mean you're successful at it in terms of being native-like right away. No, because it has to build up over time. It's impossible for us to reduce languages into bits and pieces thinking that that's how learners are going to learn it and then somehow they reassemble them. That's not how language happens, and that's not how language acquisition happens. Now, what about the processes? Well, first of all, there's input processing, which means you've got to get appropriate data from the environment. That's happening at the same time that you're having restructuring going on in your brain, which is that as you're processing input, your brain is taking it in and doing things with it to create this language system that evolves over time. At the same time, because of the circumstances you're in, you're having to learn to make output and do output processing. And we didn't even get into today, because it's a whole separate discussion about how you learn to actually string words in real time and what the constraints are on those, because it's separate from building a mental representation. But you're having to learn how to linearize words in real-time speech. What about the context? Well, how much communicative language is the learner exposed to? What demands are made on the learner at a given time? What incentivizes the learner to actually acquire, not explicitly, learn language? So we have a multitude of things: the nature of language, the complex nature of acquisition, and the context and factors surrounding the learner that are this big system of cogs and wheels and interconnections and things that make acquisition too complex to say, okay, class, today we're going to learn set and estar. Okay, class, today we're going to learn the verb connaître. And language is too complex. You can do that and you can test it, but then you're not doing language acquisition, so you just have to know the difference. I want you, real quick, next to some of these, list 2 things you learned today. Those of you who are in both sessions can do that. What 2 things did you learn that were new, semi-new, or made you think, or you would like to learn more about? So quick, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to do that. 2 items, real quick. And then we'll have a raffle. Go. Let's see what you got. Something you learned that was new, something you learned that was semi-new, something you'd like to know more about that piqued your curiosity. Some of you came with a lot of information already, I saw, which is good. So, okay, we'll start there.
The idea of having no rules, no grammar rules, no structure, I guess, like that you can just pinpoint and focus on, no practicing. And then,
first of all, before you go on, so was that new to anybody else, the idea that language does not consist of rules in traditional sense? Was that a new idea for some of you? Okay, some of you are semi-new maybe. Okay, what else?
And then along with that, how can I take that, how can I put that to my classroom and take away vocab lists and all these things that we're so used to doing.
Yeah.
How can I do that with my kids when I have 50 minutes?
Yep, exactly. Something else that you learned new, semi-new, or piqued your interest you want to know more about?
Very general, but how important the role of the science of linguistics plays in becoming an educator of other people. I know many people here have only taken, I know for me, I only took 2 linguistics classes in my degree program to become an instructor of a foreign language, and this is the basis of everything when it comes down to language instruction.
That's why I started with that hard topic in the first hour about the nature of representation, and then later on, the nature of communication. Because we often don't think about those things, we don't talk about those things, they're not part of education, you're right. And this is what we were saying earlier, we need to make an army of experts. And just to be sure, it's okay to be doing that stuff, fill in the blank and learn the rules and that kind of stuff and showing test scores. What you have to understand is that's not making language learners. It's not. And so I'm not saying don't do that. What I'm saying is don't do that if you want to have people acquire language. Okay, one more point that's new or interesting or whatever.
I like the idea of no shortcuts and that, that input's not going to guarantee accuracy.
Yeah, that's an important point because we often talk about learners making errors. I didn't get to this point, but when you think about it really hard, there's no such thing as an error. Because whatever the learner has in his or her competence at that point in time is the competent. It's only an error because you call it that. Just like when a child is learning a language, a child doesn't make errors. Language is with the language in the head at that point in time. Okay, thank you for coming. Thank you for being a great audience. Go out there and get them.